Welcome to the screencast for Thinking and Intelligence. We're looking at the definition of intelligence. In all cultures, it's the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and use your knowledge to adapt to new situations. Notice that the definition doesn't include having a lot of facts stored in memory. That's because our view of intelligence is how you use information to solve problems and to adjust to situations. In research studies and in most intelligence tests, intelligence is whatever the intelligence test measures. This tends to be academic knowledge, school smarts. Most traditional intelligence tests measure thinking skills in three areas: mathematical, logical reasoning, spatial reasoning, verbal linguistic skills. You can get a score on an IQ test for each of those three categories and one overall score that would represent your overall intelligence. This is often referred to as your IQ score. Are you comfortable having a test score based on the above categories representing how smart you are? In other words, what are some ways that you are intelligent that aren't measured by academic knowledge or those particular three areas up above? In the past, some students have mentioned that they have street smarts, or they struggle with academic knowledge but perform very well on the job, problem solving in real life. Well, it's true that intelligence tests don't measure all the ways that people are smart, and that is one of the problems with intelligence tests. Over the years, there have been many different theories of intelligence. Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence supports the idea that intelligence comes from multiple forms. He noted that brain damage can diminish one type of intelligence but leave others intact. You might be familiar with people who have savant syndrome, for example. On a traditional intelligence test, they may score in the mentally retarded range. However, they would have one or two skills that are genius status. For example, a person who may not be able to compute any type of math problems but could hear a piece by Beethoven and sit down on a keyboard and reproduce that after one hearing. Howard Gardner proposed 9 different types of intelligence. In Unit 2 materials of Blackboard, there is a multiple intelligence inventory or survey. You can complete the survey by checking any statements that apply to you. This is not an intelligence test, it's just an inventory. You can add up your score for each section and see what areas you have your greatest strengths according to Howard Gardner's theory. Each area or section is labeled below. They are also listed in the PowerPoint: linguistic, logical mathematical, spatial, musical, bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalistic, and existential. If you don't complete the inventory that I was just showing you on the screen, you can look through these, read through these, and probably tell which ones you have the greatest strengths in. From a personal perspective, I tend to score pretty high on bodily kinesthetic. I've always been athletic and skilled in sports. I also score very high in spatial intelligence. I've always been good at seeing patterns and transforming spaces for efficiency, mentally being able to rotate things in my mind and imagine accurately how they would appear from a different perspective, things of that nature. Nowadays we hear a lot about emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the ability to perceive, understand, and use emotions. If we look back at Gardner's theory, emotional intelligence is the same thing that Gardner was speaking about when he talked about interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence. Some recent research indicates that a person's emotional intelligence is a better predictor of their success in life than any other type of intelligence. That's because your emotional intelligence relates to how you get along with others, how you read other people, how you respond to other people. This slide shows some different components of emotional intelligence. You will be able to get an idea of your emotional intelligence by looking through these components. Perhaps you know someone who's low in emotional intelligence. That may be someone who doesn't pick up on nonverbal cues very well. For example, someone who talks your ear off as you stop responding to them and work on your computer while they're talking, thinking that they'll get the hint that you're busy, but they don't seem to understand. They just keep on talking and talking and talking. Those are people we would say score low on emotional intelligence. It is said that women generally have stronger emotional intelligence than men. They seem to pick up on nonverbal cues and other people's facial expressions more easily than men do. There are lots of ways to measure intelligence. If you take a free intelligence test online, you shouldn't put much weight on the outcome of that. That's because modern intelligence tests have gone through years and years of analysis and statistical documentations to refine them, to ensure that they have the qualities to measure intelligence. To take one of those tests on your own would cost over $200. Anything that's free is probably not worth paying attention to in terms of the results. Most intelligence tests, as mentioned previously, measure areas in terms of mathematical logical reasoning, spatial or visual, and verbal linguistic. There are some examples on the screen that would relate to some of those areas. Here are some sample questions on a website that relate to some of those. Questions you see now are for the verbal linguistic category. Logic. Mathematical. And my favorite, spatial. For any test to be considered acceptable, it has to meet 3 criteria. This is not only true for psychological tests or tests of intelligence. All good tests should meet these criteria. They should be standardized, reliable, and valid. Standardization means that the test is given to a large number of people. The results of those tests are averaged across the group, so we can see how the average person performs on that test. For example, if we were developing an intelligence test, we would give it to a large group of people with a variety of ages, and then look at how all 18-year-olds performed on the test, and all 20-year-olds performed on the test, and all 40-year-olds performed on the test. Then when an 18-year-old takes the test, we can see how they did on the test compared to the average 18-year-old. That allows us to determine if your intelligence is above or below average. Your intelligence test score is often represented as an intelligence quotient, which is your mental age divided by your chronological age times 100. Your chronological age is your birth age. So based on your birth date, how old are you? Let's say you were 20 years old. The 20-year-old took the test and performed on the test at the same level as the average 18-year-old, then we would say your mental age is 18. In dividing those, we get 0.9. Multiply that by 100 to get rid of the decimal point, and your IQ is 90. That is a little below average. If you were 20 years old and you took the test and performed at the same rate as the typical 20-year-old, we would say that your mental age is 20. Dividing those gives you 1 times 100 gives you 100. So you would have an IQ of 100. An IQ of 100 is average. That means, based on your birth age, you're performing mentally at that age of a typical person of your age. If your mental age was higher than your chronological age, then your intelligence quotient would be over 100, meaning you're above average intelligence. If we look at intelligence test scores in the population, remember that 100 is average, and the majority of people do in fact have IQs near 100. Lower scores below that become less frequent. The lower the score is, the less common it is. You'll notice that there aren't a lot of people who fall into that range. Likewise, getting smarter than average also becomes less common the smarter you get. So scores above 130 are considered genius status, and there aren't a whole lot of people who have that. But you'll notice that the overall frequency of these scores is a bell-shaped curve. It is sometimes called a bell shape or a normal curve, where the majority of people, about 70% of the population, scores between 85 and 115, with higher and lower scores than that becoming less frequent. Now let's look at reliability. Reliability is a way to determine whether the test yields consistent results. Let's use an example of a scale, a weigh scale. Let's say you step on the scale in the morning and you weigh 150 pounds. An hour later, you step back on the scale and it says that you weigh 162 pounds. A half hour later, you step on the scale again and it says 143. Would you consider the scale to be a reliable measure of your weight? Nor would I. This scale is not reliable. Therefore, there's no way it can be accurately measuring your weight. If, however, you stepped on your scale 3 or 4 times a day and you always had a very similar weight, then we could determine that the scale is reliable. Just like an intelligence test. If you were to take an intelligence test more than once over a short period of time, your scores should be very similar, because intelligence doesn't change dramatically over short periods of time, just like your weight. Once a test is reliable, then we can determine if it's valid. Now, validity refers to what the test is supposed to measure. Does the test really measure what it's designed to measure? In the case of intelligence tests, they're designed to measure intelligence. In the case of a weigh scale, it's designed to measure weight. So let's say we have a reliable weigh scale, but is it valid? That means perhaps every time you stand on that scale, it will tell you that you weigh 150 pounds, so it's very reliable. But how do we know you really weigh 150 pounds? Is it possible that your scale is off by 10 pounds and it's consistently giving you a reading that's 10 pounds too light? So to understand if the scale is really valid, we may want to try other scales or other ways to take your weight. And if those are all in agreement with each other, then we can conclude that the scale is in fact valid. To determine if an intelligence test is valid is a little more difficult. Let's say you took an intelligence test 3 times over the course of 6 months, and your score was very consistent each time. That tells us that the test is reliable. Now, how do we really know, though, that that score represents your intelligence? Well, we don't really have another test we can give you to determine that. So what we can do to determine validity is to look at other things. For example, highly intelligent people, on average, earn more money than less intelligent people. Highly intelligent people tend to have higher status positions or jobs than lower intelligence people. And it's not true in every case, but in general there is a trend in that direction. We can look at things like that in the real world to determine if intelligence tests are an accurate measure of intelligence. If we find that the test is valid, then we have a great test that we can use to determine people's intelligence. Notice though, or at least remember, if a test is not reliable, then there's no way that it can be valid. So reliability is a prerequisite for validity. You can't have a test that accurately measures intelligence if the test scores you're getting are inconsistent. So reliability has to come first. Then we can check for validity. This is why most intelligence tests, the good ones, that are standardized, reliable, and valid, cost over $200. There's been an awful lot of work put into those. Next topic is related to the nature-nurture debate. How much of your intelligence comes from genetics, and how much of it comes from environmental factors, such as your experiences? This is a question that has plagued psychologists for years, not only with respect to intelligence, but all kinds of personality characteristics as well. In fact, this particular topic in relation to intelligence has received more research emphasis than almost any other topic in the field of psychology. Let's watch a video that kind of addresses some of these issues.
Identical twins start out as a bizarre accident. As with the rest of us, when sperm meets egg, an individual is formed. But then something remarkable happens. The single developing embryo splits to form two identical people. So it's not surprising, since they started out as one person, that they're so much alike. But similarity is boring, scientifically speaking. It's really the differences that are the thin end of the wedge. They allow us to get inside the nature of all our lives. Corey and Eric are, believe it or not, identical. Yet Eric is much bigger than Corey and has been since he was born. Next to their older brother Tyler, you'd think there were three brothers of different ages.
He's bigger than him. And I'm bigger than him.
And my head's bigger than Corey's. He doesn't like when I punch him. I love he'll punch me right now.
The differences between twins begin to appear almost from conception. It's not fair, but one twin often gets the lion's share of nutrition in the womb. Corey and Eric's case is severe, and that's why Corey came out so much smaller. And the effects of being malnourished as a fetus can persist into adulthood. At the University of Louisville, they've been studying twins for over 40 years. Hundreds of twins have passed through here.
And Eric, you can stand right next to him, right there, okay? Okay.
Corey and Eric have been visiting the university since they were born. Here, they are regularly weighed, measured, and they have their IQ
You weigh
tested.
44 and a half pounds.
Other than the fact that one of them is taller than the other one, they're as much alike as any pair of identical twins for the basic building blocks, intelligence, personality, and temperament that we see in any of these pairs.
Now, look at this puzzle. Put
The
this one
biggest
together
single
as fast as you
factor in determining intelligence is our genes. But environmental influences such as food, education, and most of all parents can have important stimulating
Put this one
or
together as quick as
stunting
you can.
effects.
Tell me when you're finished.
When Corey was first tested,
Please, you can.
he was not only shorter than Eric, he also had a lower IQ. The remedy was that both twins got lots of stimulation at home and at the institute. Corey's IQ score rose fast. Eric's didn't.
It's not
Now they have similar scores.
okay. First,
What this research shows is that intelligence is like height. Without proper stimulation, you'll never reach your genetic potential. But equally, if you're already there, you probably won't go much higher. It's an example of the value of twins to science. Plainly, we could design an experiment like this for rats, but not for humans. It would be too cruel.
So if you want to make a prediction about a twin's intelligence by the time they reach their adult years, your best prediction can be made on the basis of how far the mother and the father went to school.
It seems you can't make children taller or smarter than they are programmed to be. Like athletic ability, intelligence can certainly be nurtured. But unless it's already in the genes, serenading your baby with Mozart is not going to make it into a genius.
So, how much of your intelligence actually comes from your genes, and how much of it comes from your experiences in life? One way we can help filter out the effects of genetics and the environment is to examine identical twins. Because identical twins share the same genes, we can compare their intelligence. Let's say we have identical twins who were raised together in the same house from birth. Many research institutions have a large pool of identical twins that are available for research. When we research intelligence test scores on identical twins, we find that the scores correlate at plus 0.87. You might recall that that's a very strong correlation, which means if one identical twin scores 115, the other identical twin almost always scores very close to 115. Likewise, if one identical twin scores something low, like an 80, it's very likely that the other identical twin will also score a low score around 80. So this is a very, very consistent result. It's a very strong correlation. When the IQ score of one identical twin is high, generally the IQ score of the other is high. When one is low, the other is low. So what conclusions can we draw about the influence of genetics on intelligence from this strong correlation? The answer is nothing. Now, it may be easy to think that because they're genetically the same and they have very similar IQs, that intelligence is all coming from the genes. But there's something else similar about identical twins who are raised together. That's right. As you can see on the PowerPoint slide, they also share very similar environmental factors or experiences. For example, they've probably received very similar parenting styles, very similar quality of education, family economic status, the kinds of foods they eat, the kinds of activities they participate in are probably all relatively similar. So we can't attribute the similarity of their IQ scores just to their genes. It could be a lot of environmental factors that are similar also that are contributing to the similar IQ scores. What we need is a comparison group. And a great comparison group would be identical twins who are adopted at birth and raised in different environments. Research institutions also have a large pool of these types of identical twins to study as well. The IQ score correlation for identical twins who are raised apart in different households is also pretty high, plus 0.72. But it's not quite as high as identical twins who were raised in the same household. So what might account for the difference in the correlations of their scores, plus 0.87 versus plus 0.72? If you're thinking environmental factors might be contributing to those differences, then you're correct. In fact, when we look at correlations for a variety of family members, we see identical twins reared together with a very high correlation, identical twins reared apart with a slightly lower correlation. Fraternal twins only share 50% of their genes, just like all other siblings. Fraternal twins come from two separate eggs fertilized by two separate sperms, unlike identical twins, who are single egg fertilized by a single sperm, which then splits into two after fertilization occurs. You can see that fraternal twins reared together have even a lower correlation than identical twins. That could be accounted for by the fact that they are genetically different from each other. Also, non-twin siblings who also share 50% of their genes reared together have even a lower correlation. The difference between these two groups might be explained by the fact that fraternal twins, although they are no more similar to each other than other siblings, have higher IQ score correlates because they've been treated more similarly. They're the same age, they've been to the same schools, probably have a lot of the same teachers, things of that nature. Basically, what we find is that the more similar people are genetically, the more similar their intelligence is. But we can also see from this data that environmental factors do in fact have an influence on intelligence as well. Heritability is a topic addressed in the book that's often confused, even by a lot of professionals. The heritability estimate for intelligence is generally around 50%, but that does not mean that 50% of your intelligence comes from your genes. We can't determine that yet because intelligence can be a lot of different things, and we don't even know how many genes would attribute to all the different types of intelligence that comprise the way we think about things and solve problems. What heritability estimate is that the heritability is the variation in a trait that we can attribute to genetic differences. So for example, if I were to give an IQ test to everyone in the class, there would be some variability in scores. What we would say about those scores is that probably about 50% of the differences in IQ scores is due to the fact that you have everyone in the class has different genetic backgrounds. And half of the differences in IQ scores would be due to the fact that you have different upbringings, different environmental factors, different experiences in life. That's a lot different than saying that 50% of your intelligence comes from your genes. So heritability is just an estimate of the influences on the variation or variability of a trait. There are a lot of environmental factors that can influence intelligence. The quality of education, the kinds of food a kid eats, quality of parenting, the wealth of the family, the amount of stress in the household or in their environment. All of those things can influence a child's intelligence in both good and bad ways. For example, wealthy families tend to live in wealthier neighborhoods, which tend to attract more experienced teachers who get paid better at their schools, and kids tend to benefit from better educational experiences. In Bloomington Normal, our education system is pretty standard for the most part. We don't have many schools that really struggle. But if you were to travel to some low-income areas in inner city Chicago, for example, you would see a very different type of school system. In fact, right now in Detroit, Michigan, there's a lot of trouble occurring in the schools because there's a lot of services that the schools are doing without, a lot of technology, old textbooks, run-down classrooms that are hard for students to concentrate in. So wealth does have an influence on the quality of education, and your education does affect the way you think, which in turn relates to your intelligence. Genes probably place a limit on how smart a person can get. But the two things, genes and environment, interact with each other. They don't act alone. For example, if a child had both parents who are genius status, and that child inherits half of his genes from his mom and half from dad, this child is probably going to be pretty darn smart. That's just from genetic influence. But if you were to put that child in a box at birth and raise him in a box without interacting with him, without giving him toys to play and books to read, there's no verbal interaction. When that child is 10 years old, if you took him out of the box, he would be approximately as smart as the box. So that means no matter how good his genes for intelligence are, without an environment to influence his thinking, to turn those genes on and get those brain cells activated, he will not be a very smart kid. In the video we watched a little bit ago, it said that one of the children received more nutrition in the womb than the other, and as a result, he was taller and also brighter than his identical twin sibling. But when his other identical twin, the lesser intelligent of the two, was given a lot of stimulation, mental stimulation, he caught up to his brother. That's how we kind of view the influence of genes. That genes kind of establish the point of how high your IQ can get. The environment, your experiences, for example, influence whether or not you actually reach that potential. That's referred to as the reaction range. It's a potential range of outcomes for a trait like intelligence, which depends on both genetics and your environment. If you look at the diagram or the little chart or graph on the screen, you'll notice the genotype A person has very good genes. That person would be less influenced by a poor environment than a child with genes that aren't as good for intelligence. So like genotype C, for example. Notice both of those kids could be raised in a poor environment, but because the genotype A kid has better genes, he ultimately will still end up with a higher IQ. In an enriched environment, they will both flourish, but the kid with the good genes will flourish more than the kid with the bad genes. So when someone says, you can be anything you want as long as you put your mind to it, ultimately we have to disagree with that. You can't turn any kid into a genius. If he doesn't have great genes for intelligence, there's no way you can train that kid or teach that kid or shape that kid into a genius. Just like if you wanted to raise your child to be 7 foot tall. He might be 7 foot tall if he has the genetic instructions to grow that tall. But if he doesn't, there's no way you will ever get that kid to grow to be 7 feet tall. You can give that kid all the best nutrition in the world you want from the day he's born, but if his genes don't allow him to grow to 7 feet tall, if he does not have that potential, there's no way he'll ever grow to 7 feet tall. If it was that easy to create really tall kids and geniuses, lots of parents would be doing that, because who wouldn't want their kid to be a genius, and who wouldn't want their kid to play in the NBA, for example? So how does the environment influence intelligence? Well, we mentioned some of those in the previous slide. One of the things we notice early in life are kids who are raised in a very restrictive environment. That has a negative effect on brain development. Sometimes that brain development is stunted to a point that even if you were to bring those kids into an enriched environment, they may never catch up with their same aged peers because the damage sometimes can be pretty substantial and hard to overcome. It is unfortunate, but there are lots of orphanages in the world yet today where they don't have enough staff and resources to adequately stimulate the children who are placed for adoption. Romania, China, for example, also, as well as many third world countries, have lots of children who will suffer in their brain development early in life due to a lack of stimulation. For many of those kids, they may never catch up to the average kid their age in terms of intelligence because the damage to their brain development is too significant. When we look at intelligence tests among different types of people, one of the more drastic differences has to do with race. White Americans tend to perform about 10 or 15 points higher on an IQ test compared to black Americans. Now you have to remember those are averages for groups. Certainly there are some black Americans who score very high and some white Americans who score low. But when you look at the average of the groups, the average score for white Americans is around average, 100. The average score for black Americans is below average, about 85. Hispanic Americans, by the way, fall somewhere in the middle there between those groups, and Asian Americans slightly higher than all three groups. So the question is that due to genetic differences in our from our ancestry, genes we've inherited over generations from our ancestors? Are they affecting intelligence for certain races? Or is that primarily due to environmental factors? Many years ago, a book was written called The Bell Curve, and it was quite controversial. It was written when I was in graduate school taking a statistics course, and I remember my statistics teacher being fascinated by the book. In the book, the researchers, authors, for example, actually noted the difference in IQ scores and concluded that it was due to genetics, and that the fact that you can't change your genetics meant that if you were black American, for example, you were just unfortunately going to kind of have to live with the fact that most black Americans aren't going to be as smart as white Americans. One of the problems with their research is that they didn't adequately take into account many environmental factors that could be contributing to these differences. For example, if you look at income status of different race groups, generally speaking, Asian Americans have the highest average salary in the United States, followed by white Americans and then black and Hispanics. What effect does financial status have on IQ? It's pretty significant. As I mentioned earlier, if you have wealth, you tend to live in wealthier parts of town with higher quality schools. You also tend to have more qualified teachers, more resources in the classroom, and more resources at home. With greater wealth, there also tends to be less stress in the household, and parents available more in the evenings to help kids with their homework and to monitor their kids' behaviors. Imagine if you live in poverty and you go to a low-quality school and you come home as a child and you have homework to do and your parents are working late to try to pay bills. When they come home, you may not have the best foods in the world. There may be a lot of stress due to the financial issues at home. You may even live in a neighborhood where you have to worry about crime and issues like that. Today we would say the authors of that book had it wrong. It's not genetic differences that cause differences in IQ scores among different race groups. It's actually environmental factors.